Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Lital. That was so beautiful. A beautiful setting. Thank you, Dr. Tali and Jeff. And thank you all for being with us tonight. Earlier this week, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan, a colleague and a friend, spoke at the American Zionist Movement Biennial. And you might have read about his speech. It got some press. In a room filled with Jewish leaders, he addressed head-on the deep fissures within our community regarding our relationship to Israel. And in his remarks, Rabbi Cosgrove said something striking and brave, but also troubling. He said that in our discussion around Israel, we must, quote, avoid the reductive and destructive tactic of labeling people with whom we disagree either as self-hating Jews or colonialist aggressors. And he continued, by making unconditional support for the Israeli government a litmus test for Jewish identity, we ourselves have inflicted harm on the Jewish future. Now, his point was not about endorsing one policy or another, one prime minister or one political party over another. He could have said the exact same thing about a different government. His point was about how we treat one another, how we fail to have difficult conversations with each other around Israel in particular from a place of love. We alienate each other, especially when we do this, especially younger Jews. And we might know that, some of us, from our own families, from experiences we've had with friends and children of friends, but it's certainly something that we've seen in studies and surveys and opinion polls. When our debates are fueled by hatred and judgment, we do damage to relationships and to Jewish community more broadly. And it had me thinking about how there has to be a better way, another way of having these conversations and approaching this situation we find ourselves in today. And then I turned to this week's Torah portion, Parashat Vayeshev, which offers a beautiful path. So let me remind you of the context. Joseph and his brothers are locked in painful conflict. Why? What's the conflict about? Well, a number of things. First of all, Joseph is his father's favorite, and his dad makes that known to Joseph and to all the brothers. Not a good parenting choice. Just keep that in mind. Don't play favorites. Don't make it obvious. And then Joseph has these dreams about his brothers and about his mother and father, for that matter, that are very hurtful to them. In his dreams, which he then shares with his family, another tip, no need to share everything you've ever thought or dreamt about. He shares with his family the dreams that they are bowing down to him, that they treat him like he is the sovereign, like he's a god, and they come to resent them. He's also a tattletale, the Torah tells us. Another tip, nobody likes tattletales. It's just the way things are. And then the Torah tells us how the brothers feel about Joseph. And first we read in Genesis chapter 37, verse 4, Vayiru echav ki oto ahav avihem mikol echav vayisnu oto velo yachlu dabro leshalom. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. So much so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. It's painful to read, but it's also something that's not so difficult if you have a sibling to relate to. There are those moments when you have this passionate anger towards a sibling that you can't even make sense of. You can't even understand it sometimes. And so we read it right there in the Torah. That's how Joseph's brothers feel about him. It says they hated him. Then later, he shares the dream of them bowing down to him. First, they hate him. Why? Because his father favors him. But then we read about the dream, and he tells them about the dream. And just the next verse, it says, Vayosifu od sno oto. And they hated him even more. They hated him a lot, and then they hated him even more. And then a few lines later, we learn about Joseph's second dream. This is the one with the moon and the stars. And they even made a musical about it, I think. It was really quite good. And so the moon and the stars are bowing down to Joseph. And you'd think that they would hate him even more, but that's not what it says. In Genesis 37:11, after this dream, it says, Vayikanu vo echav. It doesn't use the word sinah. It uses a different word, the word kinah, which means something else. And I'm going to talk about that. Now, I'm going to bring in the name of a sage that if you are a regular at Stephen Wise Temple or if you join us regularly online, you've heard me quote again and again. It's my cousin, Rabbi Eliezer Davidovich, who was born in 1878 in Volvo, which is part of the Hungarian Empire today, Western Ukraine, and he was murdered in 1942 by the Nazis. And miraculously, his Torah was preserved because it was hidden away and recovered after the Holocaust by his grandson, who's also my cousin, who later gave a copy of this Torah to me. And this is what Rabbi Eliezer Davidovich teaches us about the difference between those words sinah and kinah. Sinah is hatred, kinah is envy. They're not the same thing. Hatred closes the heart. Hatred says, I can't stand you. I can't tolerate you. You are not part of my story. We are not in conversation anymore. Hatred fractures families and communities. Envy can be very destructive, but it can also have a different energy, and it can create something quite different. Rabbi Davidovich writes about a concept that's first talked about in the Talmud, kinat sofrim, the envy of scholars, which is a different category of envy. And this is considered a good thing, something that is permitted and actually even encouraged. So what is the envy of scholars, this thing that can inspire positive behavior according to the rabbis? It's when a sage hears the Torah, the wisdom, the teaching of another sage, and the first one says, wow, I wish I had known that. I wish I had learned that. I wish I had had that insight. And it doesn't just have to be scholars. It could be in other vocations, in other realms. You're a painter and you see something another painter has done and you think, wow, I wish I had that little bit of creativity. I wish I had thought of that. As a musician, as a business person, as a teacher, you name it. That's kinat sofrim. When you see the expertise of another and you envy them in this positive way. Kinat sofrim, according to our tradition, increases wisdom, and it happens through a switch. And I want to think about the switch with you for a moment, because I believe it's really important in relationship to this conversation around things we disagree about. Instead of thinking, when you hear someone say something that you oppose, instead of thinking, how dare she say that? How dare she think that? You say, it's interesting that she believes that. I wonder why. Maybe I'll ask her. Curiosity happens. And then there's another switch. The next move is from, it's interesting that she thinks that, to, even though I disagree, I think I admire something about what she said. I admire something about what she believes. And maybe you could even get to the place of, I love that you think that. It's not how I see it, but I love that you see it that way. That's so interesting. So how did this happen with Joseph's brothers? The Torah doesn't tell us how this switch happens from sinah, from hatred, to kinah, to this type of envy. And the Torah doesn't even tell us that it's that positive kind of envy, but I like to think that for a moment, because the story of Joseph and his brothers does have a happy ending. There is a reconciliation in the end, they do come back together in a type of harmony. So what makes that switch possible? So my cousin, Rabbi Davidovich, puts it this way. He says, Kin'u vo kinat sofrim. Somehow they came to envy him with the type of scholarly envy, this positive kind of envy. And then he explains, Zot kina al haderech hayashar shetarbe chochma. This is an envy that follows the proper path. This is the right kind of envy, shetarbe chochma, the kind of envy that increases wisdom. Ordinary envy can destroy relationships, but the envy of scholars can deepen them. Ordinary envy says, you have what I want. That's how we often think of envy. But Kinat Sofrim says, you inspire me to become more. In a fractured Jewish world, it's a gift to rediscover this teaching, I believe. A reminder that even in conflict, we can choose admiration over alienation. We can choose respect over resentment, and we can choose growth over grievance. Now, I want to acknowledge it's not always possible to admire the opinion of another person, even your fellow Jew. I want to acknowledge that there are some opinions that are truly dangerous. There are some opinions that are so deeply rooted in misinformation, they can be harmful to our community or to others. And some opinions are simply hateful, bigoted, racist, anti-Semitic. Judaism does not ask us to make this switch and find a way to admire cruelty or prejudice or calls for violence. I'm not talking about that. But too often, we hate people whose opinions are not themselves hateful. They're just divergent from our own. Let me say that one more time because I think it's important. Too often we hate people whose opinions are not hateful. They're just divergent from our own. And so that habit, that reflex almost, especially in a world that is driven by algorithms and all sorts of other forces that are trying to get us to be filled with this type of sinah instead of kina. The world is actually actively pushing us in that direction. In such a world, it's easy to default to that place, that when we hear that divergent opinion, the response is a type of sinah, a type of hatred. But this is where I believe this teaching about kinat sofrim becomes so urgent, so important, so vital for today. What if envy, that healthy, admiring envy, could be a model for us in the way we disagree with each other, especially around Israel, where emotions run so deep? What if instead of sinah, we tried to cultivate a little more kina shetarbe chokhmah, the type of admiration that can bring a greater wisdom? To those in our community whose worldview is shaped by universal empathy, for example, those fellow Jews who feel the suffering of all people in a deep way. And maybe it's some of you in this room or some of you joining from home, or maybe it's you, people whose hearts are deeply, deeply open to the suffering of others, including Palestinians, strangers, migrants, and others who might not be the most obvious objects of our communal love. What if we could say to those people, I admire your empathy. I admire how your heart opens to human beings everywhere. I envy your generosity of spirit, and I wish you would make a little more room for Chibat Zion, for that love of the Jewish people and the Jewish future. What if that's how we approached the conversation? I think it'd be very different. And perhaps on the other side, someone with a powerful sense of particularist loyalty whose first question is always, but is it good for the Jews? What if that kind of person, whose love for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people, is fierce and unwavering, what if on the other side, one would say to that person, I admire your devotion to the Jewish people. I admire your vigilance and your passion, and I envy your commitment. I only wish that you would make a little more space for the suffering outside those of your community, of our community as well. Imagine what our conversations would feel like if we spoke this way in person and online, in every setting. If instead of trying to win every argument, we tried to understand. If instead of hardening, which is a path to hatred, we let ourselves admire what is best in the person with whom we disagree. If our disagreements were not tests of loyalty, but opportunities of learning. Look, conflict is natural. We are family. Brothers and sisters argue and sometimes fight and sometimes even try to destroy one another, as we see in the story of Joseph and his brothers. But it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to let these conflicts descend into hatred. We can choose admiration over alienation. We can ask ourselves, what is the quality in my brother or sister that annoys me, but that can teach me? What's that value that I can see not just as something that is a little bit obnoxious, but rather also as something worthy of envy? It's not always possible, I'll admit it, but it's often possible. And I would argue more often than not, it actually is possible. And look how, as I referenced earlier, the story of Joseph and his brothers unfolds. The very qualities that irritated the brothers, his confidence, his chutzpah, his ability to dream, what happens with those qualities later in the story? These become the qualities that save Joseph's. These become the qualities that save the brothers' lives. So the very qualities in Joseph that irked them are the qualities that ultimately enable him to save their lives. The dreams that once provoked hatred, well, these are the dreams that enable him to rise up to the very highest heights of power in Egypt and save, according to the story, in some ways, all of humanity from famine. These are the qualities they come to really admire and envy. And what I'll suggest to us is perhaps our communities today can do the same. Maybe the qualities that divide us can somehow, if we're generous and curious and open, maybe these are the qualities that ultimately can teach us. And I really do think it's urgent that we have these difficult conversations in a loving and respectful way. I think the future of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, depends on it. If you look to our past, one of the things that ultimately led to our destruction in the first century of the Common Era was the infighting between Jews, our inability to figure out how to work it out amongst ourselves and how to find a path to peace and admiration and love for one another. Our unity depends on it, and our Torah offers us that language that reminds us to reach less for the default of sinah and more towards this kinah shetarbeh chokhmah. Less closing of the heart and more curiosity about the goodness in the other. More envy that magnifies wisdom and understanding. May we learn to disagree without hating each other. May we learn to admire what is best in one another. And may that loving envy guide us toward deeper understanding, toward healing, and toward shalom.